So, just to start us off today, I want you to imagine something. Imagine spending years just pouring your most agonizing feelings of isolation, your deepest fears, your most private observations into a diary.
Right, like a deeply personal hidden space.
Exactly, a totally private space. But now, imagine that the person at the absolute center of those writings, like the unspoken anchor of your entire emotional world, is your wife.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. And she is literally the only person on the planet you're hiding this diary from. I mean, you publish it, you put it out into the world for total strangers to dissect.
Wait, but not her.
No, not her. You keep it a total secret from the woman sleeping right next to you.
Well, I mean, that creates an immediate, really uncomfortable friction, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, we usually think of writing about a loved one as this ultimate act of intimacy.
Mm.
So to frame it as an act of concealment completely subverts our expectations of how art and domestic life are supposed to, intersect.
I completely agree. And welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we are exploring a really profound framing question that stems directly from that exact friction.
Yeah, it's a huge question.
Right. Like, how do you capture the intensely agonizing feeling of being geographically displaced, but remaining completely emotionally tethered to a past life? And, what happens to people around you when your mind is living on two entirely different continents at exactly the same time?
It's a heavy topic, and to map that psychological territory, we were looking at a really remarkable piece of literature today.
Yes, we are.
Our source material for this deep dive is the 2017 poetry collection titled Beaming Petals in a Henna Vine. It was originally written in Sinhala by Nirasha Gunasekera, who is a male Sri Lankan poet, part of the diaspora currently living in Melbourne, Australia.
And what makes this collection so captivating right from the jump is the intersection where it operates. I mean, Gunasekera is writing in his native mother tongue, but the canvas he's painting on is this entirely foreign, sprawling landscape of Australia.
Yeah, it's a massive contrast.
It really is. We're not just looking at a translation of words here. We're looking at a translation of an entire worldview.
And the thematic atmosphere of this collection is incredibly dense because of that. As we explore the mechanics of these poems with you, you'll definitely notice a very specific emotional weather.
Emotional weather, I like that.
Thanks, yeah. It's heavily melancholic. It deals a lot with the jarring, everyday reality of displacement. But, it is also filled with these hyper-vivid, almost microscopic observations of nature and domestic life.
Yeah, the poet operates with this almost voyeuristic intimacy. Like he's a ghost haunting his own neighborhood, just constantly watching, constantly recording everything.
Exactly. But before we even get to the mechanics of that watching, before we reach the very first poem in the collection, the reader is confronted with this really bizarre structural anomaly.
Oh, right, the prefaces.
Yeah, the book actually has two completely distinct prefaces.
Yeah.
And the contrast between them, well, it fundamentally alters how you perceive the entire collection going forward.
It really does. It's a brilliant study in contradictions, honestly. It almost serves as a sort of psychological test for the reader before the poetry even begins. Let me set the stage with the first preface.
Go for it.
So, this one is written by the author himself. And Gunasekera writes this poignant, incredibly vulnerable confession. He admits to a profound, lingering guilt for stealing time away from his wife and his two children to write these poems.
Yeah, he literally calls the book a guilty flower, doesn't he?
Yes, a guilty flower. He says he was physically present in his house, sitting right there in the living room. But mentally, he was completely gone.
Just checked out.
Exactly. He describes keeping the poems locked in the dark cell of his heart. He actually states that his wife is the unspoken anchor of the work. Like sometimes the poems move toward her, sometimes they move away from her, but she is the gravity of the whole collection.
Right. But despite all that, he kept the entire manuscript, even the title, a complete secret from her right up until it was printed.
Which is wild. But his stated reasoning for this is deeply romantic. He claims he wanted her to experience the book completely fresh, as a unified whole, so she could get that pristine scent of a newly opened book.
It's very sweet, really.
It is. The remorse is just palpable. You read this, and your heart is wide open. You, as the reader, are primed for a raw, emotional diary of a man just struggling to balance his art with his family in a totally new country.
Right. And then you turn the page.
Oh, boy.
And the entire emotional foundation you just built is systematically dismantled.
You just get hit by a cement truck of high-level literary theory.
Literally. Because the second preface is this massive critical introduction written by Suman Wickramaracci. And, I mean, the title alone is intimidating. It's called An Exploration of the Non-Existence of the Soul or Subject.
Just rolls right off the tongue.
Right. Wickramaracci completely bypasses the romance. He ignores the author's stated intentions about his wife, and he immediately applies dense Lacanian psychoanalysis and Roland Barthes' concept of the death of the author.
Okay, so let's unpack that for a second because death of the author sounds super dramatic.
It does. To break down the death of the author concept, mechanistically, I mean, think of it like releasing a piece of open source software.
Okay, I'm following.
Once the developer puts the code out into the world, their original intention for how it should be used essentially ceases to matter. The users, or in this case, the readers, download the text into the hardware of their own minds.
So they interpret it through their own operating system.
Exactly. The author's intended meaning is essentially dead. The reader's interpretation is the only active program running.
So Wickramaracci is essentially telling us right out of the gate, hey, do not trust the author's romantic explanation for his secrecy.
He goes much further than that, actually. Wickramaracci describes the act of writing poetry not as some emotional release, but as entering a, quote, torture chamber of language.
A torture chamber, that's intense.
Yeah. He uses Jacques Lacan's framework to argue that language itself is a Trojan horse.
Now, I want to pause on that Trojan horse idea for a moment because I feel like it is so counterintuitive to how we usually think. I mean, we are taught that language is a tool, right? We think of vocabulary like a wrench or a hammer that we pick up to build a bridge between two minds.
Right, but Lacan argues the exact opposite. Language is not a tool you hold. It is a system that holds you.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, like when a child learns a language, they think they are receiving a gift that allows them to communicate their internal desires. But language is pre-existing. It has its own rules, its own historical baggage, its own limitations.
So when you download this Trojan horse into your brain, it covertly rewrites your operating system. It essentially conquers the human subject.
Precisely. Because, you can never perfectly articulate the raw, chaotic emotion inside you using the rigid, prepackaged words available in a dictionary.
There's always a gap between the actual feeling and the word you use to describe it.
Exactly. And living in that gap, that space of inadequacy, that is the torture chamber Wickramaracci is talking about.
And applying this to Gunasekhar's experience as an immigrant makes the theory even more aggressive, doesn't it?
It really does. Wickramaracci argues that being culturally and geographically displaced creates what he calls a melancholic subject. He says the poet is driven by unconscious desires dictated by what Lacan calls the big other.
The big other. Okay, if I am tracking this correctly, the big other isn't a specific person, right? It's more like the invisible algorithm of a society.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it.
It's the unwritten source code of cultural expectations, like the symbolic order that tells you what a successful life looks like, or what a good husband looks like, or what a properly integrated immigrant is supposed to look like.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. The big other is the gaze of society that you internalize. And Wickramaracci argues that Gunasekara is trapped trying to navigate the big other of his new Australian reality, while he's still basically programmed with the linguistic and cultural software of Sri Lanka.
So how does Wickramaracci use this intense framework to interpret the author keeping the poems a secret from his wife? Because, the author just said it was to give her a romantic surprise.
Well, Wickramaracci strips the romance out entirely, using this psychoanalytic concept called the unknown known.
The unknown known, that sounds like a riddle.
It kind of is.
Yeah.
It refers to a belief or a desire that drives our behavior even though we consciously refuse to acknowledge it. So Wickramaracci suggests that subconsciously, Gunasekara kept the poems a secret because he realizes he does not actually know what his wife's true desires are.
Oh, wow. That is dark.
Yeah. The secret keeping is framed as a symptom of an unbridgeable psychological distance. He orbits around her in his poetry, but keeping the book hidden is actually an unconscious admission of the limits of his own understanding of the woman he loves.
Man, I struggle with this intensely academic framing. I really do. I mean, think about it like this. If a poet hands you a delicate, bruised piece of fruit, which is exactly what his own preface feels like, is it actually helpful for a critic to immediately hand you a scalpel and a biology textbook?
That's a really vivid analogy.
Right. Does this dense Lacanian psychoanalysis actually enhance our emotional connection to the diaspora experience? Or does it just trap the raw poetry in an intellectual cage before we even read the very first stanza?
I mean, that tension is basically the central gamble of the book's architecture. Wickramaragdi would argue that understanding the invisible psychological machinery, the torture chamber, the big other, makes the poems profoundly more impactful because you are seeing the puppet strings of the unconscious mind at work.
But consider an alternative lens for a second. What if we just reject the death of the author completely for a moment?
Right, let's play devil's advocate.
What if we read this book not as the symptom of a fractured Lacanian subject desperately trying to appease the invisible algorithm of society, but simply as the incredibly grounded, visceral diary of a man trying to make sense of a new continent using his mother tongue?
A much simpler human reading.
Exactly. What if the secret keeping isn't some phantom limb of psychological distance, but just a guy who wanted to give his wife a really beautiful, tangible gift?
Well, if we take that approach, the burden of proof then falls entirely on the words themselves. To determine whether the academic preface reveals the actual truth of the text or merely projects a theory onto it, we really have to look directly at the poet's toolkit.
Right. Does Gunasekera's actual language support this torture chamber complexity, or is he doing something much more grounded?
So, examining his craft, the first thing that becomes overwhelmingly apparent is Gunasekera's absolute precision.
He is incredibly precise.
Yeah. When you strip away the critical theory, you find a poet who operates with an incredible economy of words. He uses striking, deeply physical, natural imagery to convey these massively complex internal states, and he leverages the friction of translation to his advantage.
And he utilizes the Australian landscape not just as a physical setting, but as a direct mirror for his own psychological state, doesn't he?
Absolutely. The friction you mentioned earlier, writing about arid, sprawling Australia using Sinhala, which is a language evolved in a lush tropical island, it creates this immediate sense of displacement in the reader.
Let's actually test that against a specific poem from the collection. There's one titled, Don't Ask Me. The narrative is super simple, right? The poet is just sitting under a small plum tree on a summer evening trying to read a book.
Right, but he specifically notes that this is a tree where the fruit just rots and falls to the ground entirely unpicked.
The imagery there is just steeped in stagnation. He's sitting there and he gets distracted from his book by these dry, dead flower petals from the previous spring that have fallen and become trapped between the pages of the book.
And instead of just brushing them away and continuing to read, he actually succumbs to the distraction. He sits there, methodically picking up the dry petals, putting them in the palm of his hand and just blowing them out into the evening wind.
It's such a sad, quiet image.
It is. The poem ends with him basically asking the reader not to ask him what he's going to do now that the spring is gone and he's covered in these white petals.
So if we break down the mechanics of why this poem works so well, that rotting plum tree serves as a vital structural beam for the emotion. And bringing a touch of that psychoanalytic framework back, because I think it actually proves useful right here, the tree functions as what Lacan would call an excess.
Right. And to explain excess, think of it like paying for a really expensive gym subscription you never actually use.
Oh, I know that feeling.
We all do. But you feel too guilty to cancel it because it represents the person you wish you were. It is essentially an artifact of a fantasy.
That is exactly the right mechanism here. The plum tree represents a life that has bloomed, but just hasn't borne the right fruit or, fruit that no one actually desires to consume.
Yeah. The poet is sitting under the literal physical manifestation of his own unfulfilled potential.
It's the rotting illusion of the diaspora dream, this promise that moving to a new country would yield a perfect harvest, but it just hasn't.
And the action of blowing the dead, dry petals out of the book creates such a vivid cognitive dissonance. Because reading a book is typically an act of moving forward, right? You're consuming a narrative.
Right, you're making progress.
But the petals stall him completely. He becomes mesmerized by the dead artifacts of a season that has already passed. It's this visual representation of a mind entirely stalled by memory.
He manipulates time and momentum so brilliantly. And don't ask me, time is stagnant, it's rotting. But he can switch speeds entirely, utilizing structure to create real motion. We see this perfectly in the poem Easter Holiday.
Oh, Easter Holiday is a masterclass in the cinematic use of spacing and really the architecture of silence.
It really is. Set the scene for us.
So the poet is observing a distant swamp, and he's just watching a flock of giant Australian pelicans.
And Gunasekera uses the literal spacing of his free verse on the page to mimic the absolute stillness of that swamp. The words are incredibly sparse, the lines are broken in ways that physically force the reader to pause.
Yeah, he describes these massive birds silently, slowly dipping their beaks, searching the muddy water for food. And the pacing of the words forces you to hold your breath right alongside the observer.
The environment feels totally suspended, and then without any warning in the text at all, the giant birds just take flight.
The language suddenly accelerates.
Yes. The spacing tightens up. The poem culminates in this striking, ominous visual. The flock of pelicans casts a massive, dark shadow over a distant church.
He is manipulating our visual field to create complete emotional whiplash.
It functions exactly like a camera lens. It's like he uses a macro lens to focus intensely on a tiny, rotting plum or a single dry petal trapped in the spine of a book. And then he violently snaps the lens to a wide-angle shot, pulling way back to show this massive, dark pelican shadow swallowing an entire church building.
And that wide-angle shot introduces a sudden, heavy scale of foreboding. The silence of the natural swamp is violently interrupted by the shadow falling over the church.
And the church itself is a highly loaded symbol, right?
Completely. It represents
Yeah.
colonial history, Western societal structures, basically the established order of his new country.
So the wild, untamed reality of Australia, the pelicans, temporarily eclipses the imported, structured reality of the church, all while the immigrant poet just watches from the periphery.
He deploys that exact same technique of sharp sensory contrast in the title poem of the collection, Beaming Petals in a Henna Vine.
Let's get into that one because it layers cultural contrasts so well to explore the friction of aging in a foreign land.
He begins it by observing young Lebanese girls in the city, specifically noting their golden cat-like eyes.
And he uses their youth and vibrancy to trigger this really bittersweet realization of his own advancing middle age. And the wordplay he uses to construct this realization relies on a really heavy sensory clash.
Yeah, he contrasts the incredibly sugary, rich taste of Mediterranean baklava, a honey-soaked pastry, against the bitter, hard pill of aging and alienation.
You essentially experience the cognitive dissonance of tasting the overwhelming sugar and the sharp bitterness in the exact same line of poetry.
Which forces the reader's senses to kind of short-circuit, which perfectly mimics the psychological state of the diaspora.
Experiencing the sweetness of a safe, prosperous new country simultaneously with the bitter grief of losing your homeland.
Exactly. And the title itself, Beaming Petals in a Henna Vine, is the ultimate symbol of this. I mean, a henna vine is native to South Asia and the Middle East. It is deeply rooted in his Sri Lankan cultural memory.
Yet here, in this poem, it is blooming in an entirely different context. He describes walking carefully so as not to wake anyone from this dream, sinking into the deep waters of the Mediterranean in his mind, dying, and being reborn.
This ability to zoom in and zoom out, to contrast baklava with bitterness, to place a Sri Lankan henna vine next to an Australian swamp, it is not merely an exercise in vocabulary. It is the architectural foundation he uses to explore the central philosophical tension of the entire book.
Which is the tension between belonging and alienation, the core immigrant experience.
Right. The themes of diaspora identity are woven into the very DNA of the text. But what elevates Gunasegera's approach is that he rarely writes directly about his own explicit struggles with immigration.
Yeah, he doesn't center himself as the hero of the story.
No. He approaches his own alienation sideways, by quietly observing the marginalized figures around him.
A perfect manifestation of this is the poem Black-White. And as we explore this for the listeners, we are looking strictly at the psychological and literary dissonance the poet captures on the page. Our goal here is to impartially examine the scene he witnessed and just how he chose to construct it.
Absolutely. The setting is a weekend in a busy Australian urban center. The poet is standing on the street, observing indigenous Aboriginal Australians playing the didgeridoo.
And he describes the sound of the instrument as an ancient, sorrowful crying. He reaches deep into the geographical reality of Australia, explicitly connecting the sound of the didgeridoo to Uluru, the sacred sandstone monolith in the heart of the outback, and to the honey ants of the desert.
He drags this ancient, deep-rooted history right into the middle of the concrete, modern urban noise.
And the contrast he builds in the next stanza is really jarring. While these ancient, sorrowful sounds are echoing off the buildings, the poet watches white tourists crowding around.
They pose for smiling photographs with the Aboriginal musicians, toss $1 or $2 into a hat, and then they just move on.
The poet watches this transaction happen and concludes the poem with a devastating philosophical inquiry. He wonders about the true color and nature of happiness. He questions if an unfulfilled, bitter life despite the performance of smiles for a camera lens, possesses a fundamentally different color of joy.
This scene perfectly encapsulates what we were calling the poetic self as observer. Gunasekera almost never centers himself as the protagonist. Instead, he acts like a phantom.
Right.
He witnesses the Aboriginal musicians with a profound, quiet empathy. And that empathy stems from a shared, unspoken recognition. He is a displaced person observing a culture that was violently displaced within its own native land. He sees his own internal fracture mirrored right there in the transaction on the street.
And he utilizes this same observational distance with the elderly in another poem called The White Man Walking His Dog.
That one is so poignant. He sketches a portrait of an 80-year-old man waking up early in his neighborhood. The man is wearing an old leather hat and smoking a Havana cigar as he walks his dog.
And as the man walks, the poet notes that local boys have thrown stones at him and hurled insults, mocking him as a crazy old man.
But the psychological focus of the poem is the old man's reaction, or rather his complete lack of one.
He stoically ignores the abuse entirely. He bends down, picks up his dog's waist with his bare hands, takes a deep drag of his cigar, and blows a massive cloud of smoke straight up into the sky. He does not speak a single word. He just keeps walking.
And Gunasekara watches this quiet defiance and refers to him in the text as a marvelous man. The poet recognizes a fellow survivor. The old man's refusal to engage with the mockery, his commitment to his simple routine, it all resonates deeply with the poet's own isolation.
There is a really strong connection here between memory, nostalgia, and emotional distance. I mean, the poet uses these distinct Australian elements, the old man, the Aboriginal musicians, the pelicans, to trigger internal reflections.
Right. He doesn't exist fully in Sri Lanka anymore, but he is clearly not integrated into the social fabric of Australia either.
So he has built this third liminal space in his mind. He lives permanently in the space of the observer.
And living in that liminal space fundamentally alters how a person perceives time. When you are deeply integrated into a community, time is like a river that carries you along with everyone else. But when you are an isolated observer, time becomes something you just watch passing by from the riverbank.
It's so true. Think about the routines you cling to when your life feels entirely out of control. Like maybe it's the exact sequence in which you make your coffee when you are overwhelmed with stress at work.
Right. Routine creates an artificial structure when the natural structure is just missing.
Exactly. And Gunasekara illustrates this perfectly in a poem simply titled, well, it's just 4X's.
Oh, the cafe poem. It is an exquisite dissection of the mechanics of routine.
It really is. The poet observes a woman at a local coffee shop. Every single weekday at exactly 7:30 a.m., she arrives, and her routine is hyper-specific. She matches her shawls, her earrings, her bracelets, and her shoes to her outfit perfectly, rotating colors for all 5 days of the work week.
The precision of her actions is recorded like he's gathering scientific data.
She sits by the glass window. She looks at the cross on a distant church for exactly 1 or 2 minutes. She meticulously smokes a cigarette. She drinks exactly 2 sips of coffee. And at exactly 8 a.m., she gets up from her wicker chair and leaves.
The poem concludes with the line, "That's all I know about you."
Which is so striking.
For this woman, and for the poet documenting her every move, time has been reduced to a repetitive closed loop. When your identity is unmoored by displacement, these rigid routines, matching a shawl, sitting in the exact same wicker chair at 7:30 a.m., they become the structural beams holding up your sanity.
And the poet recognizes her routine because he is engaged in his own obsessive routine of watching her.
Yeah, but consider the sheer psychological toll of this existence for a second.
Right.
How does a poet manage to sustain this level of intense, agonizing observation without his mind completely burning out? I mean, he is absorbing the despair of the rotting plum tree, the sudden menace of the pelicans, the quiet dignity of the mocked old man, the rigid survival tactics of the woman at the cafe.
It requires an exhaustive amount of mental processing power to just filter the world like this constantly.
Absolutely. And that exhaustion brings us to an evaluation of Gunasekara's raw talent and his authorial voice. We have to ask, is this voice purely instinctive, flowing out of him naturally, or is it a highly controlled, deliberate construct?
But I think the poem Tomboy provides a really compelling answer to that. The poet observes a young girl who is attempting to present a hyper-masculine aesthetic.
Right. She's wearing a check shirt, tight denim, a heavy white metal necklace, and she has chopped her hair really short. She is projecting this tough exterior to the world.
But the poet's eye bypasses the performance entirely and catches the micro-expressions. When her phone rings, she answers and attempts to use a deep, serious, authoritative voice.
And Gunasekara notices the voice cracking under the strain. He sees her soft forehead wrinkling. He identifies the deep vulnerability that she is desperately trying to bury beneath the heavy boots and the half-smoked cigarette tucked behind her ear.
The poem concludes with a reflection on the pain of disguise. He asks a rhetorical question about whether it is absolutely necessary to put on the mask of a man simply to survive the vulnerability of being born a woman.
And this is where his natural talent is most undeniable, I think. His emotional intelligence allows him to feel the psychological weight of her daily performance. It is an instinctive, piercing empathy.
At the same time, though, he possesses this deliberate, masterful control over his imagery, particularly when navigating abstraction and ambiguity.
Oh, for sure.
He demonstrates an incredible confidence in blending his two worlds in a poem called The Night Keeps Awake.
This piece operates essentially as a Gothic Australian poem, but it is rendered through a deeply Sri Lankan psychological lens.
The atmosphere is incredibly oppressive. He describes the night as feeling heavy and ominous. Outside his window, a branch of a blue gum tree, which is a native Australian eucalyptus, is scraping against the glass.
But the poet describes the branch as looking like a long-nailed white hand trying to get in.
Out in the distance, cutting through the heavy darkness, he hears the literal howl of a red fox. But his mind, which is irrevocably shaped by the tropical environment of his childhood, immediately associates the suffocating blackness of the room with a black panther prowling in a jungle.
He essentially translates his ancestral fears into his new geographic reality. He seamlessly fuses the primal terror of the Sri Lankan night with the stark flora and fauna of Australia.
The blue gum tree and the red fox become vessels for the phantom of the black panther. It reveals poetic voice that is highly adaptable and conceptually fearless.
Honestly, I would argue that this level of control requires a certain degree of detachment.
I think that is actually the core vulnerability of the entire collection. There is a haunting detachment to all of his observations. I mean, he writes about these people, the tomboy, the woman at the cafe, the Aboriginal musicians, almost like a wildlife documentarian observing a fragile ecosystem.
That's a great comparison.
You sit in a blind, you record the behavior of the subjects, but you strictly do not interfere. You do not talk to the woman at the cafe. You do not help the old man.
Right.
Does his intense control over the language, the beautiful framing of these poems, actually mask a deeper inability to connect with the human beings he is observing? Is the poetry not a bridge, but a shield?
That is a phenomenal critique, and it isolates the central tension of the work. The friction between brilliant, empathetic observation and paralyzing emotional detachment is exactly what dictates the collection's overall impact on the reader.
Which naturally leads us to a broader assessment of the strengths and the constructive critiques of Beaming Petals in a Henna Vine.
Well, the standout strengths are formidable, there's no denying that.
Yeah.
His precise cinematic imagery is masterful. The piercing empathy he extends to marginalized strangers is deeply moving.
Yeah.
But most importantly, his unique fusion of Sinhala lyricism with the harshness of Australian landscapes is truly groundbreaking. He is proving that his mother tongue can stretch to encompass entirely new worlds.
He also deploys a razor-sharp wit when aiming at societal critiques. We haven't touched on his humor much yet, but there is a poem called 36 Mothers that is just a brilliant piece of satire.
Oh, I love that one. It acts as a necessary pressure valve for the melancholy in the rest of the book.
It really does. So he observes a group of affluent school mothers waiting to pick up their children. He titles the poem with the socially demanded measurements of female perfection, 36, 24, 36.
Right.
And he describes these women as being completely dripping in modern diaspora wellness culture. They are wearing the latest Fitbit bands. They are loudly discussing the virtues of organic fruit, non-fat fresh milk, multivitamins, and the V-shaped torsos of their personal gym trainers.
The imagery is perfectly curated to represent the performance of modern integrated success.
Then he physically juxtaposes that entire manicured group with one other mother standing nearby, a woman who has recently given birth to her second child.
Yeah, the contrast is stark.
She is wearing a loose blouse over a wrinkled stomach. Milk is visibly leaking from her breasts. She looks utterly exhausted as she struggles to organize a messy pile of books in her tired child's school bag.
And the dialogue he assigns to the tired mother completes the contrast perfectly. She is not talking about organic fruit or Fitbits. She is quietly asking her friend about the cost of tuition classes, the endless cycle of house chores, and seeking advice from the local temple monk.
It is a sharp, instantly recognizable critique. He uses the juxtaposition of organic fruit and leaking breast milk to trigger a cognitive dissonance in the reader.
It highlights the absurdity of the performative wellness culture against the grinding physical reality of actual motherhood and survival.
It proves he isn't just brooding under a rotting plum tree. He has a highly critical eye for the absurdities of the society around him.
However, balancing those strengths requires a really constructive look at the accessibility and density of the collection as a whole.
Yeah, reading this collection back to back feels akin to walking through an incredibly beautiful but completely unheated museum in the dead of winter.
That's a strong image.
You walk from room to room, you look at the exhibit of the pelicans, you look at the tomboy, you study the rotting plum tree, and you recognize the mastery of the curation. But eventually, the ambient cold of the building just seeps into your bones.
The sheer weight of the isolation begins to suffocate you.
Exactly. And you find yourself desperately wanting to step outside the museum into the sun just to feel a moment of unbridled, uncomplicated warmth.
The collection's greatest strength, its unwavering philosophical and emotional depth, frequently becomes its greatest barrier. The poet's permanent residence in the liminal space of the melancholic observer risks severe repetition.
And if a reader takes Suman Wickramarach's Lacanian preface to heart before starting, the text can feel overwhelmingly academic.
It transforms from a visceral, emotional experience into a rigid puzzle you're tasked with solving.
The lack of resolution is heavy. He diagnoses the isolation, but he offers no cure.
The sheer density of the melancholy might alienate a reader searching for moments of genuine connection or narrative resolution. But, Glunaseca is committed to the truth of his displacement, and the truth is that neat resolutions rarely exist in the diaspora.
So as we step back to evaluate the ultimate legacy of this cold, beautiful museum of a book, what is the emotional and intellectual footprint of Beaming Petals in a Henna Vine?
Well, situating this work within the broader landscape of contemporary diaspora literature, Gunasekara has managed to carve out a wholly unique, highly defensible space.
Yeah.
He completely bypasses the exhausted, predictable tropes of immigrant literature. He does not rely on cliches about missing his mother's cooking or the comedic struggles of learning a new transit system.
He maps the internal fracture instead of the external logistics.
Beautifully put. He built a highly personalized, deeply psychological topography of his dual existence. And in doing so, he achieves something monumental for the Sinhala language.
He proves that it is infinitely elastic.
Yes, he demonstrates that a language born in the tropics is entirely capable of capturing the terrifying howl of an Australian red fox and the tapping of a eucalyptus tree, just as beautifully and naturally as it captures the delicate scent of a Sri Lankan jasmine vine.
He expands the absolute boundaries of what Sinhala poetry can comprehend and describe.
It is a profound linguistic and emotional achievement.
But as we conclude our deep dive today, I want to pull us all the way back to the very first image we discussed. I want to return to the poet's own confession in his preface.
The secret manuscript.
Yes. Think about the mechanics of what he actually did. He admitted to feeling immense guilt for creating this art. He literally stole hours and days away from his wife and his children. He locked his mind away to observe total strangers. A woman matching shawls at a cafe, an old man smoking a cigar. And he poured his absolute deepest vulnerabilities into verses about them. He kept this entire world completely hidden from his wife so she could experience the book fresh.
But put yourself in her shoes for a second.
Exactly. Imagine being the anchor of a man's life. When she finally breaks the spine of this newly printed book, what is she actually discovering?
That's a heavy thought.
She is discovering a husband who was physically sitting next to her on the couch, but mentally he was thousands of miles away. He was wandering through cherry orchards, watching pelicans take flight in a distant swamp, and intimately dissecting the secret fears of people she has never even met.
It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question.
Does the creation of truly great, transcendent art inherently require an act of quiet, psychological betrayal against the people we love the most?
Something to think about the next time you open a deeply personal book and wonder what it cost the people standing just outside the frame.
A haunting and necessary question to leave lingering in the air. Thank you to all of you listening for taking this deep dive into the source material with us. We will be back with another fascinating exploration of sources in our next installment.